All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to the sixth and final session of Plague Literature in the Time of Coronavirus, hosted by Lawrence Technological University. I am very pleased to be here and glad you can join us. My name is Paul Johnson. I'm Associate Professor of Literature here, and I will be the host for this evening. I want to give a few thank yous to some folks, and then I'll introduce our panelists, and we will take it away. First, Dr. Phil Vogt, my colleague, who will be with us in a sort of shadow capacity that I'll talk about in just a moment, but who has organized this excellent series. The College of Arts and Sciences for sponsoring us, and Scott Lehman and eLearning, who've just done a fantastic job. There's Scott. Thank you again, Scott, bringing us all together. Tonight's panel focuses on Susan Sontag's essay, AIDS and Its Metaphors, but we will also be relating this work to her earlier piece, an essay she wrote in 1978 called Illness as a Metaphor. What I'm going to do is introduce our panelists and describe the format to you. And then Kenny Fountain and I have agreed to introduce the two essays briefly to just give those who haven't read it an overview of the work, and then we'll open up the conversation. So our panelists, Dr. Kenny Fountain is an associate professor of English and director of writing across the curriculum at the University of Virginia. He is the author of Rhetoric in the Flesh, Trained Vision, Technical Expertise, and the Gross Anatomy Lab, which was published by Routledge in 2014. His research and teaching interests include the rhetoric of science and medicine, political rhetoric, and the history of rhetoric. And he just informed us, I hope I'm not letting the cat out of the bag, that he's recently working on conspiracy theories, which seems pretty relevant for our particular moment too. Dr. Tim Warren is a senior lecturer in the Irvin D. Reed Honors College at Wayne State University in Detroit. His degree is in early American history with a cognate in communication. He has just completed teaching a new seminar titled What Plagues Detroit that studies historical development of the city around issues of disease, medicine, and public health. Prior to his academic career, he worked as a reporter and a freelance writer, including medical writing for hospital systems and physician groups. Dr. Sheila Tian is with us. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get Sheila on video this evening, but she is here via phone, so you'll be hearing her voice throughout the evening during our conversation. Dr. Tian recently retired from the English department at Michigan State, where she taught 19th to 20th century American and British literature, especially the novel and literary theory. She completed her undergraduate work at the University of Toronto, where she majored in English and did the equivalent of minors in French and classics, mainly ancient Greek, and she did her graduate degrees at Yale. Dr. Tian is a Henry James specialist, and most of her publications focus on James's work, although she has recent publications on Philip Roth and Daphne du Maurier. She continues to write on James and is writing now on Constance Fenimore Woolson. After earning his doctorate in intellectual history at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Phil Vogt came to Lawrence Tech, where he has taught for 21 years. He published a book on John Locke in 2008 and said everything he has to say on that topic. So go read the book. His interests have since shifted to ancient history and philosophy, particularly the Platonic dialogues. And again, my name is Paul Johnson. I teach in the core curriculum here at LTU, primarily a world literature survey and upper division electives in poetry and poetics, literature and technology, and literary theory. I'm also the co-director of the Humanity and Technology Lecture Series at LTU with my colleague Franco Delogu. My first book was called Writing in Real Time, Emergent Poetics from Whitman to the Digital, which came out in 2017 through Cambridge. And I'm right now working on two projects. I'm working on a book on contemporary literature's public language and co-editing the Wiley Blackwell Companion to American Poetry with Mary Balkin and Jeffrey Gray. So our format for the evening will be as follows. I'm going to give a very brief sort of 5-minute overview of some of the big moves that Sontag makes in Illness as Metaphor. And then Kenny is going to introduce AIDS and its metaphors. And then we're just going to open up the floor to our panelists. And I think what I'll do to start us off is I'll ask each of our panelists to just sort of start with a kind of initial response to these texts. What are some of the issues that are sort of central on their minds that they would like us to talk about? We'll let the conversation go from there. We really would like audience participation throughout the night. So there is a Q&A button that is at the bottom of your screen. If you click on that button, you'll be able to type in questions. Phil will be monitoring the Q&A channel, and he will either convey your questions to the panel, or he may invite you to turn on your mic and speak to us directly so we can have a little bit of dialogue with the audience. So we want this to be interactive and we want it to be open to all. All right, so let me talk us through Illness as Metaphor. As I said, it was published in 1978, first as a serial essay in New York Review of Books and then in book form. It's probably worth noting that Sontag later acknowledged that her own diagnosis with breast cancer was the occasion for writing the essay, but she never actually mentions her own illness in the work. She kind of keeps herself removed from that. Her central task is to explore and analyze the way metaphors are used to make sense of disease. And she focuses in on what she calls the two master diseases of modern times. And by a master disease, she's talking about a disease that can kind of bear all this sort of mythological or metaphorical or ideological weight. And the two master diseases are tuberculosis, which she associates with the 19th century. Tuberculosis, also referred to as consumption, is a bacterial infection that primarily attacks the lungs. And then the second major master disease that she looks at is cancer, which she associates with the 20th century. As she puts it, these diseases have been spectacularly encumbered by metaphor. And the bulk of the essay traces these various metaphors to show how they reflect various fears, beliefs, and anxieties, but are also used to psychologize and kind of associate the disease with the patient. So one of her big targets here is how these metaphors are ultimately an attempt to kind of attach the disease to the patient and make the patient somehow responsible for the disease. I think it's also worth noting that she's interested in the way these metaphors change over time, the way they evolve and add new meanings, and also how they die off. So one of her points is that tuberculosis loses its metaphorical significance precisely as it becomes treatable. So when a disease is in this stage of uncurable or untreatable threat, it tends to gather these metaphorical meanings. To just give you a sense of some of the contrast that she draws, I'm just going to highlight a few of the more interesting points she makes about tuberculosis and cancer, and I won't go through these in detail. So for her, tuberculosis, as associated with the 19th century, is associated with excess. It's associated with an excess of passion. Hypersensitive persons are supposed to get tuberculosis. It's delicate. It's associated with kind of romantic ideals. Whereas in cancer in the 20th century tends to be associated with repressed, defeated, or absent forms of desire. There's a kind of almost modernist alienation I think she sees with cancer and the cancer victim. Tuberculosis in the 19th century is associated with artistic personalities. So she talks about all these artists who have tuberculosis, including some who want to get tuberculosis and the kind of tuberculosis chic that she sees in the 19th century. There's this quote from the poet Shelley to Keats, who of course died of tuberculosis at 25. Shelley wrote to Keats to console him that this quote, "This consumption is a disease particularly fond of people who write such good verses as you have done." So I mean, that just like, I think crystallizes this idea that the disease sort of tends toward artistic personality types. In contrast, again, with cancer, she's interested in the way it tends to be associated with people who are sort of anti-heroes. At one point, she even uses the phrase that like those who have cancer are often treated as if they're somehow losers, right? They're not these excessively energetic types. Tuberculosis is very individualizing, she argues. It's often treated as this kind of refinement of the spirit. So the body is sort of wasted away so that she says, you are refined down to the real you. Whereas in contrast, cancer is treated as something that destroys individuality. She says that it's the replacement of the you by not you. It's dumb, it's sort of erasing, it's relentless. And then this gets us into some of the metaphors for treatment that she's interested in. So because tuberculosis is associated with this kind of emotional and passionate excess, doctors describe treatment of tuberculosis as coaxing the patient back to health, right? So you have to kind of try to revive the patient. Whereas cancer attacks, and cancer must be battled. And so she spends a lot of time on the military metaphors that cancer tends to be associated with. Cancer is invasive, whereas tuberculosis, on the other hand, I think is associated more with like economic metaphors. It's consumed, you waste away, your body is spent by tuberculosis, right? So she goes into many other examples. These are just a few to give you a sense of what she's talking about. And I think it's important to note that she's not actually arguing that the diseases do these things. What she's arguing is that these are the metaphorical meanings that have gotten attached to the diseases historically. While these are primarily the psychological metaphors she's looking at, she also analyzes the way they get amplified when applied outward to describe social and political realities. So she talks at times about the way cancer is sometimes used in political philosophy to describe, say, something like urban blight, right? You could think of like the city as a site of disease, or a political enemy or an ideology can be treated as a cancer, right? So to stop out the cancer of communism or something like that, right? You can think of those metaphors. And she has a number of other applications I'm hoping we can get to later on in the discussion. I'm particularly interested in the way she tries to link these metaphors to different kinds of economic moments too, and economic ideologies in the history and development of capital. But I'll just end by noting that, as you can tell, the analysis is really pretty rich and expansive, and sometimes to my reading almost feels a little contradictory. But I think that's part of her exact point, is that metaphorical work creates this kind of overdetermination of these illnesses. These illnesses actually tend to mean too much, as it were. And that excess of meaning is really what she's interested in exploring and ultimately revealing. And if I can, I would actually just like to end by giving you all a flavor of the prose by reading her preface to the essay, because I think it also explains her ultimate purpose, which I hope also we might get into in conversation. So this is the very opening to the essay. She writes, "Illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place. I want to describe not what it is really like to emigrate to the kingdom of the ill and live there, but the punitive or sentimental fantasies concocted about that situation. Not real geography, but stereotypes of national character. My subject is not physical illness itself, but the uses of illness as a figure or metaphor. My point is that illness is not a metaphor, and that the most truthful way of regarding illness, and the healthiest way of being ill, is one most purified of, most resistant to, metaphoric thinking. Yet it is hardly possible to take up one's residence in the kingdom of the ill unprejudiced by the lurid metaphors with which it has been landscaped. It is toward an elucidation of those metaphors and a liberation from them that I dedicate this inquiry." So again, a very brief survey, but I hope that gives you a sense of the argument and the primary focal points of the text. And then I'll turn it over to Kenny, who's going to talk us through the follow-up essay, AIDS and its Metaphors.
Thanks. So in October 1988, Susan Sontag publishes an essay in the New York Review of Books titled AIDS and Its Metaphors. Now, she's writing this, by all accounts, 7 years into the crisis, the AIDS crisis. 5 years after the retrovirus that causes AIDS had been isolated and identified in a lab, both in France and America. 3 years after the FDA approved the first antibody test to test for HIV. A year after AZT, which was the first antiretroviral drug, appeared to and was approved by the FDA to treat HIV. In 1989, Sontag publishes an expanded version of that essay, and it's the work we have today. The first version that appears in the New York Review of Books is actually section 5, or begins with section 5 with her discussion of AIDS as a plague. Now, AIDS and its metaphors, in part, seeks to describe, in both illness as metaphor and AIDS and its metaphor, repeatedly she'll use the word describe to characterize her own project, but also the project of others. And when she's describing and discussing and citing other passages So there's something that I think that's really interesting about that idea of describing and bringing to life. But she's describing the various metaphors, analogies, figures used to make sense of AIDS. She's also providing a kind of commentary on the consequences of that figure role logic on what was then called PWAs in the 80s, people with AIDS. On those deemed most at risk, which were racial and sexual minorities, largely gay men, but also African American and people in sub-Saharan Africa. But she's also interested in the potential consequences of those deemed least at risk at the time, which was white, middle-class, heterosexuals. AIDS in its metaphors is grounded in some of the references to her previous work. And in it, she uncovers a number of conceptions of AIDS. AIDS as an invader of both the physical body and invader of the body politic. AIDS as an illness of the foreigner, of the deviant, of the other. AIDS as a new form of plague, but also AIDS as an always looming apocalypse that shapes how we experience other looming catastrophes. She draws from works, a wide range of works from philosophy to ancient literature, all the way to 20th century literature. And she demonstrates a, for the time, very keen understanding of current ideas in medicine and public health. This essay is written at a time when cultural theorists, literary theorists, artists, and other public intellectuals were first beginning to write about the crisis. A very famous special issue of the journal October was published in 1987. It was, the special issue was called AIDS, Cultural Analysis, Cultural Activism. And so Sontag is writing at a moment where there is a kind of openness in criticism, in that her work would be taken up by academics, but it was largely geared toward a kind of public audience who themselves might want to try to make sense of what is happening. This essay would go on to be this book length or small essay, about 90 pages, would go on to be extremely influential to other researchers researching and chronicling the crisis, from historians to sociologists to literary theorists. And so one of the things that I think is really exciting about it for us now is to think about the ways that it isn't a tight work. She is exploring and leaving questions open, I would say, as much as she's trying to answer them and shut them down. But that's one of the things that makes it such a rich, beautiful text to return to at a moment like this, in another pandemic, with an illness that still feels in many ways very mysterious. And that's all.
Perfect, thank you. So maybe what we could do is just go around and open up by sharing sort of our initial, this is the thing that really drives me, or I want to respond, I'm thinking about. And I'd like us off the applicant to like the question until we've sort of maybe thought through what she's doing conceptually in her work. Because I know we'll get, and I'm sure the audience will help us get there too. So Sheila, would you mind giving us some of your initial responses? Nothing, just what would you like us to be talking about tonight?
Sure, and if I may, I'm going to draw upon some notes that I sent to the four of you because I wasn't sure I was going to make it tonight at all. I'm very grateful that I was able to phone in. So here are just some of my initial thoughts. First, and I think that Kenny and Paul have both implied this in your rich accounts of both of those texts. First of all, there seems to be a fundamental tension between Sontag's desire towards sort of unmetaphoring illness in the way that both of you have described, and on the other hand, her clear recognition that there is no such thing as unmetaphoric language. And indeed, when she quotes Aristotle in the opening of AIDS and its metaphors, and this is on page 93 in the Picador, she quotes Aristotle as saying that metaphor consists in giving the thing a name that belongs to something else. Well, that in fact is a definition of the sign per se, it seems to me. I mean, all of language, all of signification is about a displacement of a name or a sign. And that's a kind of tension that I think is in play in both of these texts. And as I wrote to several of you this afternoon, I write about tropology, and so her analysis of metaphor is very compelling, and it seems to me to invite rhetorical analysis in its own right. So for instance, getting back to the question of metaphor, which, as you know, means literally a carrying over or a transfer. Metaphor is a kind of transfer that never actually delivers, and it always leaves an unreadable residue of some kind. And I try to talk about this to some extent in my own work. And Phil and I share an interest here, possibly also with others, in the work on metaphor by Derrida and de Man. So it seems to me that Sontag's discourse reflects awareness of this unreadability of metaphor, or this unreadable residue that's a structural part of metaphor. So for example, in a passage that begins on page 108, she talks about AIDS as a clinical construction of a phenomenon, a disease that is unavailable as such. It's perceptible only in its effects or its symptoms. So this seems to me that in rhetorical terms, this is a move that aligns AIDS with the trope of hypotyposis, which I know some of you are familiar with, which has a genealogy from Aristotle forward. And for Kant, hypotyposis is the sensible showing forth of pure concepts. So the sensible instantiation of something that is non-sensible or non-material, without which there would be no cognition whatsoever. So in literary terms, trying to think of this in terms of literary theory, hypotyposis, which is a lot like the related term of catachresis, the figure for which there is no literal term, like the leg of a table or the face of a mountain. I mean, catachresis, for those of us interested in tropology, it's a kind of wild card of tropology because it indicates the kind of vanishing point of metaphorical or literal language. That is to say, catachresis is the term that undoes the distinction between literal and figurative language. So you can see how this relates back to my point a moment ago that I think there's a tension in Sontag between her desire to sort of undo the ideologically and socially damaging metaphorization of these illnesses and her recognition that you can't talk about illness or anything else in terms which in fact are not metaphorical. So so hypotyposis is also inextricable from the uncanny, which, as we know from Freud, is the kind of non-category or non-concept that undoes all binary distinctions, such as the distinctions between inside and outside, living and dead, spiritual and material, body and mind, and a lot of those binaries figure in her discourses, both of you have pointed out. So if I'm justified in making this alignment of hypotyposis with what Sontag is up to, this seems to me to raise both the rhetorical and theoretical stakes of her discourse. And I do have a little bit more to say about this in Illness as Metaphor, but I can hold that off until later if you like.
Sure, that's great, because I think what we'll try to do is get some terms out on the table and then see how we can connect.
Yeah, sure.
Tim, what about you? Thank you, Sheila.
So I really enjoyed Sheila's posting, and Sheila's using literary language that I don't really have ready access to in my own discipline. But it was making me think very strongly about something I had to have a lengthy conversation about with my students in the very first lecture and that was thinking of disease as something that others people. And this is something that Sontag goes after very strongly. So let me just use a snippet that she writes. The metaphor implements the way particularly dreaded diseases are envisaged, and it's an alien other, as enemies are in modern war. And the move from the demonization of the illness to the attribution of fault to the patient is an inevitable one, no matter if patients are thought of as victims. And that's something important to keep in mind here. Already we see in our current society a certain amount of blameworthiness being attributed to those who have recovered from COVID. And they're in many ways being treated as less than people. The source of it too, if you look at how, thinking of this in terms of AIDS as well, what community does COVID have particularly strong effects on? Well, it's in many ways a despised community and one that's marginalized. And so it behooves us to take a look at Sontag's writing and to look at how people have treated disease historically here. And that concept of othering, that disease comes from the other, my goodness, I mean, it's throughout literature. You only have to look at Dickens in Bleak House. Where does disease come from? Well, it comes from this construct that Dickens makes of Tom's All Alone, a ruined slum place where horrible people at the lowest dregs of society rent temporary space, and then they move from that to spread disease to the rest of the normal community. How different is that from the way that we thought of AIDS when it first was becoming known? I mean, when I was a reporter in the time period where AIDS was suddenly a thing, people became terrified and began socially isolating and stigmatizing and removing people from the community just on the suspicion that they might be related to somebody who had touched somebody with AIDS. We actually had groups of parents demanding that other children be removed from schools because there was a thought that maybe their family had a contact with an AIDS person. So it's a really live wire that she's hit. And one other thing that really is important to me about what Sontag says, disease becomes a creator of what she calls spoiled identity. You had an identity before that was perfectly socially acceptable, but now this metaphor of whatever disease you're suffering has spoiled you and made you a less than person.
Can I make an interjection?
Please.
Sontag begins her essay on AIDS, as Sheila says, by quoting Aristotle, right? With this very brief, succinct definition of metaphor. And it comes from the Poetics. But that's not the only place where Aristotle discusses metaphor. He discusses it in the Rhetoric. So Sontag talks about metaphors, and she talks about metaphors that are dangerous. But in the Rhetoric, Aristotle talks about metaphors that have failed, unsuccessful metaphors. Unsuccessful metaphors are those which are proposed and never find currency, the ones that strike people as he says, barbarisms, as gibberish. A metaphor gains currency when it resonates, when it captures something in the shared experience of people, right? And those some of those metaphors are the ones Sontag attacks as being dangerous. The metaphors attached to cancer in her own day, she thinks actually hold back people who need to find effective treatments, right? So in a sense, what you have is you have a social process of the assignment of linguistic meaning, and then it's critiqued occasionally. The practice is occasionally critiqued by someone like Susan Sontag, who says, excuse me, we have created a metaphor, a successful metaphor, which carries worrisome implications. And so let's look at what those implications are.
Kenny, do you want to respond to Phil or?
Yeah, I think one of the things that really strikes me about the work and rereading both of them again is that her project of demystifying, and I think it also gets back to some of the things that have been said already with the idea that there is a kind of contradiction, both that she is continuously uncovering in the way these metaphors and sort of analogies. And in the first work, she often finds kind of metonymic. There's a lot of metonymy. But there's a contradictions in the way these figures get sort of culturally constructed, where they're allowed to be the thing and its opposite. But we also see that kind of tension in her own writing, in her relationship to metaphor and her relationship of demystifying these. But I think her project of demystifying, one of the first things she says in the second paragraph of Illness as Metaphor, she said, I want to describe. So when Sheila said that about hypotyposis, that got me thinking about the later sort of Roman version of that, which is either ekphrasis in argeia, kind of vividness of language that brings it before our eyes, descriptio. One of the things I think that Sontag is doing, it is a kind of mode of analysis, a mode of kind of public criticism. I say public criticism. It's obviously like aimed toward a certain kind of intellectual, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not in an academic journal. It's in a very public journal at that time. But it is a kind of project that is to set before our eyes how these metaphors work, the damage that these metaphors can do. And so I think the idea of her trying to demystify these is actually really important. She often gets misread as being anti-metaphor in a really weird way. There's an article now that's going around social media about, and it's got a title about apologies to Susan Sontag or something like that. And it's like, she's in no way anti-metaphor. She's interested in what it means when we invest certain meanings in it and the consequences of that investment, and the way that the trace, the legacy of that investment is still part of how whenever we use that metaphor, it becomes re-signified over and over again. And I think that's one of the reasons for her, the military metaphor is the most terrible, is the most damaging for her.
Well, and I mean, maybe to connect what Sheila said and what Phil said, and connect what I'm hearing, what the threads of everybody saying right here is that the metaphorical process seems to be evoked by the uncanniness, at least in the case of disease, it's particularly activated by the uncanniness of the disease that we cannot treat or fully understand, right? So not only, I agree completely with Sheila's point that the metaphor carries with it the kind of like untranslatable, or the part that can't kind of fully attach to the object, but I think that disease that remains mysterious or has mysterious elements is doing that in a material way as well, right? Like there's a gap or an uncanniness in our scientific knowledge or collective knowledge of the illness, which then forces us into these kind of metaphorical producing practices. As Phil was commenting though, I'm thinking, and this goes to Kenny's point, we use the phrase of the dead metaphor as precisely the thing that no longer has that kind of enlivening effect. But that doesn't mean we still don't use such metaphors to think with, right? So to me, one of the most interesting things about the military metaphor with cancer is how that actually translates into the way patients actually think about what their cancer is doing, right? Like what happens when you say it's an invasion as opposed to a growth, right? Like those are two very different kinds of figurative logics, and I think they have consequences. So that's just one observation about where the social practice of metaphor making is also, I think, in response to material conditions of the disease and the illness and our knowledge about that.
So interestingly, we've had diseases in the past that are no longer diseases that themselves were almost pure metaphor. One example was anemia in the time of the Industrial Revolution that largely affected women. And it was, I can't remember the exact name for it, but it made their skin appear green because they were so anemic that they became very, very pale. And this was a huge social worry. And it became a metaphor for the failure of weak people to be able to keep up with the demands of this new industrial process that was going on. And it was a huge problem for about 100 years until a very simple cure came up for it, which essentially was to get you enough iron in your diet that you weren't anemic anymore. And that disease became a non-disease. And so the metaphor disappeared. The disease itself was never a disease. It was an effect, but society adopted it as a metaphor for this failure of a group to be able to keep up with the needs of the new societal revolution.
Guys, someone from the audience, Queen Stavish, would like to jump in.
I had a question, and I was curious, what's the origin of the metaphor? Who creates it or assigns it? Is it the victim of the disease, the survivor of the disease, the medical profession, or the writer who comments on it? What's the origin?
So in her essay, there's one point where Sontag says AIDS is a clinical construction. And she views it as being, the metaphor is created by the clinicians, by the bureaucrats and the medical professionals. And in a way, that also echoes comments that were made some 20 years ago by Joan Wallach Scott on gender as a social construction. So if you look for the people in power, and they tend to be the ones creating the metaphor.
That's interesting, because that
I also think it depends on the kind, I also think, I'm sorry, I interrupt.
Oh, that's okay. I was just commenting on what Tim said, that I think that then becomes interesting, whether it's a clinical or a social creation, and where the negativity in some of the metaphors come from. But knowing a couple of people who have had COVID, they are beginning to speak of it in metaphor. The people who are actually going through the disease and what they're struggling with then also becomes, the darkness, the blackness, when you think of the Black Plague, and they're looking for metaphors for, and I've only spoken to 2 people about this, but they're looking for metaphors from previous diseases to assign for this.
And I think some of this as well, that's a really interesting question. One of the things that Sontag's definitely seems to enjoy doing in this, and I think it's one in both works, and it's one of the things that makes it so exciting to read, is her kind of tracing out of antecedents and precedents to find places in literature and philosophy where people have struggled with it, to find other places where it is cropped up but in different forms. I think one of the things that's so unavoidable about metaphors and just tropes and figures in general, whether it becomes the metaphor becomes something like an extended analogy or not, is that we're also using our daily experience to make sense of the world around us. So the way that up is good and down is bad, front, moving forward, moving backwards, like our own sort of bodily experience of the world shape the kind of metaphors that we come up with, the kind of analogies that we come up with. And if someone is in the struggle with something like cancer, right, tuberculosis, whether or not they had ever heard those metaphors, it would probably feel like that, feel like a fight, right? Emily Martin, the anthropologist, many years ago in the 90s, did studies with people in the public, asking them to describe the immune system. And they almost all describe something like a fortress being invaded. And so there are ways that these metaphors, it's impossible not to use them. They seem so natural. But one of the things that I think is quite beautiful about what Sontag does, and anybody who's studying sort of tropes and figures and their sort of consequences, is to really uncover the kind of insidious nature of them, the kind of implications of what it means to use a military metaphor. Okay, that feels good. I'm fighting. But then when someone dies, they've lost their battle.
Exactly.
They're not a hero. They're a victim. Whereas someone who lives then becomes like valorous. So I think that's really interesting, because that's one of the things that's both beautiful and kind of dangerous about any sort of figural language.
Right. And I was thinking with what Tim said, when tuberculosis disappeared, I think it was Tim who said it, that then the metaphor, or when the anemic disease disappears, the metaphor for it leaves. But I'm thinking back to biblical experience of Miriam in the Bible, when and it's gossip that she and Aaron are doing about Moses's Cushite wife, who's black, and the Hebrew is in the feminine, so it is Miriam who is punished with a skin disease, which has, some doctors say, wrongly interpreted as leprosy. But that idea of gossip being a leprosy is still is very, very modern currency still, that we look at gossip as in the same way as we look at leprosy. So that kind of metaphor has sustained through thousands of years.
If I could say, before I introduce another member of the audience, people will never stop writing obituaries that say so-and-so lost her courageous battle against cancer, right? Mm-hmm. It's too nice. No one's going to give up that language. I was thinking, though, Queen was originally asking, who is it that devises metaphors? I think the answer is we all do. It's like all of us throwing spaghetti against the wall to see what sticks. And in a sense, we're living through an incredible linguistic experiment. It's been several weeks since I've heard the phrase sheltering in place. I think it's been discarded. I think it's given away to lockdown for different reasons, political reasons. But I also want to introduce Pat Cornett, who's waiting. Pat?
I just have probably a more simple-minded comment as we talk about metaphor and using it to describe cancer, tuberculosis, the current pandemic. It seems to me, as human beings who use language in all its forms to make sense of our experiences, it is impossible for us not to use metaphors to come to grips with extraordinary experiences, particularly whether they're powerful metaphors or weak metaphors. I think as human beings, language is one of the basics of our existence. So I think, it's fascinating to talk about what metaphors are associated with diseases, with our current situation. And thank you, Phil. I hadn't thought of lockdown and shelter in place as metaphors, but of course they are. We search around in our minds and our conversations with others about how to describe something that none of us have ever experienced before.
If I could say, they're also often euphemisms. Think what is conveyed when we say that someone's being ventilated, right? What a euphemism. How nice. How nice that they're getting help breathing. But apparently it's a nightmare procedure, and the person who finds himself in that position is really in dire straits.
Well, we think of it as something conscious for them. They're on a ventilator, but the reality is they are in a coma, induced so that they won't fight the ventilator. They don't know about their metaphoric condition, which is a kind of an odd and bizarre way to think of it.
I also wanted to bring up another point, which might get us to Tim's point about othering, and this is sort of where metaphors come from. I'm interested in the way metaphors create kind of boundaries and bound certain groups together and not others. And one of the things I found really insightful reading this work is her analysis of the concept of the general public, especially with AIDS, right? So the idea that the general public is not under threat from AIDS was one of the state messages that was coming out from public health officials. And when you do that, you immediately create an identity for that general public, right? Heterosexual, white, probably middle class. And you're also excluding certain groups from the definition of the general public. So sure, one could talk about statistical probabilities and one could talk about populations and bell curves, but the trope general public is not actually talking about that, right? It's talking about creating a kind of political identity or social identity. So I think that there's an accretional effect when it comes to these metaphors. Like they have multiple sources and also multiple origin points, but that does not deny their politically efficacious from the perspective of power and social organizational function, right? There's this kind of deliberate act of a metaphor in that sense. So that's something I think that she also does really compellingly here. And I want to second Kenny's point. I agree completely. She's not anti-metaphor. In fact, she explicitly says, of course, one cannot think without metaphors, right? They're absolutely central to the way we think. I think what she's calling for is like a greater self-reflexivity about them. Demystification, as you said. I am interested in the way she says at another point, I don't want to derail the conversation here, but she says at another point in her reflections on the first essay that her goal is actually to write, not to confer meaning, which is the traditional purpose of literary endeavor, but to deprive something of meaning, which I find so fascinating, both from a strategy that she's trying to take on as a writer, but also how her own prose is so rich with meaning in its legibility, and like that you can revisit it and read it again and again. And I'm curious if that has something to do with about the genre of the essay too, like what the essay does as a kind of activity of kind of immanent critique and its capacity to burrow within something and kind of like dig away at its meaning from the inside, I suppose. But it would be interesting to think about the difference between metaphor and meaning, right? The metaphor is a kind of vehicle for meaning making or a meaning making activity, but meaning also, I think, exceeds metaphor. It's not just, I don't think metaphor is the only way in which one makes meaning. I don't know, I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but I found that an interesting characterization of her own work.
So Paul, one of the things she says in her introduction to the AIDS essay is that metaphor is a way of stigmatizing those who are ill. And her initial writing was to create not a narrative of her own illness, but to come up with an idea.
Yeah.
And I think that's that depowering thing that she's trying to do with metaphor. She uses metaphor quite a lot herself. And in fact, I came across a 1965 quote from her that the white race is the cancer of human history. Well, that's pretty powerfully metaphorical.
Yeah.
Sheila, did you want to jump in on this discussion of metaphor and trope, given your opening comments?
Well, it just, one thing that strikes me, and I think other people have been suggesting this as well, is that there seems to be a kind of inverse or even perverse relationship between the kind of underdetermination of the disease, that is, we still don't know what causes it, it doesn't have a clear etiology. There seem to be more and more modes of transmission that are being identified. So on the one hand, you have this underdetermination, and on the other hand, you have this potential overdetermination of metaphor, which I think is just beginning in this case. I mean, I think Phil's example, which I hadn't really thought of it quite in those terms, but of course, Phil's brilliant example of the shift from sheltering in place to lockdown with dramatically different, connotative meanings would be an example of that. And it struck me reading in the final passage of AIDS and its metaphors, it struck me as extraordinarily moving and quite prescient, where she talks, for example, about the struggle for rhetorical ownership of the illness, and talks about the need for narratives of catastrophe and that sort of thing. I mean, I really felt as if she were speaking unawares of our current historical moment, because I think that the rhetorical baggage surrounding this virus is just beginning to be generated, and I think it potentially has political consequences, well, to put it mildly. I mean, I think we have to be very vigilant about this sort of thing, and we would do well to emulate, Sontag's rhetorical savvy in analyzing these sorts of discursive structures.
May I jump in?
Please.
So when we talk about the things that are at stake with the ways we choose to describe experiences, the metaphors we choose, think about what's at stake with this current pandemic. This is not a medieval plague. This is a plague of modernity. This is a plague that came about because of near instant, round-the-world transportation, because of globalization, because of the appearance of mega cities, and the intrusion of humans into ecosystems where they hadn't penetrated before.
Mm-hmm.
We're in Africa now, we're eating vervet monkeys. In China, we're eating bats. And this is exposing us to pathogens we weren't exposed to before. And so modernity is at issue here. Modernity is at issue, and you see that. You see that in this sort of anti-modern, atavistic protest, the armed protest to open up Michigan, right? Open up Michigan. These people are reacting against a technocracy. They're reacting against modernity. It'll be issues. It'll be the most interesting metaphors to emerge will be the ones we don't like, right? The ones we object to. Those are going to be the most powerful ones.
Well, and then Phil, you raised 2 points that I am interested in. There's a moment in the essay where she is talking about the way she makes a point, and I think it's a slightly naive one, but I mean, not she's brilliant, so I don't have the right to call her naive, but like, she doesn't dig into it too much. Let's put it that way. It's sort of like a passing moment where she has her kind of like critique of capital moment. And she says, tuberculosis metaphors are fascinating because she argues they emerge at this kind of early stage of capitalist development that focus on the idea of like regulation and discipline and saving and thrift, right? And so this need to like save and channel and become a good producer of one's kind of like energy, right? It's like these early stages of accumulation. And that cancer emerges or becomes this kind of master disease at a moment when capital is at this sort of expansive stage, and you have like speculation and financialization and the rise of the commodity and this idea of like excess, right? So if early capitalists had a lot to do with kind of saving and disciplining oneself, by the mid 20th century especially, we get this kind of like go out and spend, you know, Coca-Cola and commodities and things like this. And so of course I had to say, well, if she was here today, what kind of anxieties or questions about our current state of accumulation or economy might COVID tap into? Because I think one of the important points she's making here is not just that the disease is a manifestation of the historical moment, but why in the historical moment that particular disease that we can't address gets weighted with all this metaphorical baggage, right? So it becomes a way to think the moment, I would argue, is part of our argument. And this is totally speculative, so, you know, it's on tape, so I'll be, you know, in trouble for this. But I am curious about how some of the responses to COVID-19 have channeled some of the anxieties we have about automation, the idea of excessive people, the idea that the robots are going to take our jobs, right? And, you know, I don't think it's an accident that one of the responses in this country has been something like universal basic income, right? Where the government's literally cutting checks to people and sending them to you and say, stay in your home. So I'm curious to see if, as we're in a process maybe of metaphorical meaning making, that some of the current moments of anxiety about the future of labor, the future of work, what we're going to do with people who are suddenly irrelevant from a market perspective. Again, I'm not saying that any of this is going to happen. I'm just trying to think through some of the ideas and moments in our own kind of stage as an economy that are producing these kind of metaphorical anxieties, and how COVID might become an outlier for them. Just as I would agree, Phil, completely, the protest movement is not, it just needs an occasion, right? Those kinds of protests will erupt again and again and again. This just happens to be the occasion because the protest is really about an anxiety over modernity. So that's really speculative, but I would think, you know, we're going to be looking for.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting to me about COVID is that, so Sontag's really interested in how diseases, cancer is personal, cancer is the personal body. It is about you know, in these myths and these metaphors, it's about a failure of the person. They haven't lived right. They've made bad choices. They've held in their anger. COVID-19 seems to be an illness of the social body. We haven't had cinematic or television or fiction, because it's too early, right? We haven't had representations of people with this. We don't get cameras in people's faces showing them this. We don't get pictures of people on the ventilators. And I think there are a lot of HIPAA reasons, privacy reasons why we don't, right? So what people see is, I don't know anybody with this. I don't know anybody with this, but I know I'm out of work. So this becomes an attack on the social body, on society. And so what do we do? If the military metaphor is the one that's ready to hand, then we're going to get out there and we're going to say those things over and over. I'm obsessed with looking at the protests and the photos and their signs. Repeatedly, they'll say things like, the treatment can't be worse than the disease. Which again is a very old, Sontag has a version of that in the first essay about cancer. So I think one of the things that we see now is that I think we have depersonalized COVID-19 in the fact that I don't think we see enough people, know enough people, have enough representations of the pain, the horror of being on a ventilator, what that actually means, what it actually means to go through a lot of these treatments that we have these medical terms for. And I think many people just see it as an attack on the social body. And the way to fight that is we're all little cells that need to just get back to work.
Well, one of the things Sontag is really worried about, I mean, she wants us to discard the military metaphor, right? That's at the end of her essay. But she's even more worried about the medicalized metaphor. Because if we can get into surveillance and tracking and isolating, then what prevents us from making this into a hardware metaphor where we simply round up all the potential victims and isolate them? And if you look at our metaphors right now, we talk about if you're in the vulnerable population, what does that mean? Oh, well, if you're less than, if you have diabetes, if you've got a heart problem, if you happen to be Black, for heaven's sakes. I mean, there are some very dangerous and strong metaphorical possibilities in this language.
Pat Cornett has been looking for an opportunity to jump back in. Pat?
Yeah, in response, I had a question or a comment which went away, but in response to what Tim just said, it occurs to me, this is what the Nazis did in Nazi Germany. They isolated the deviants, the others, the Jews, and they got rid of them. And are we in danger of doing that? If people, the other in our society, and you mentioned some of the groups who have become more susceptible and have suffered more from COVID-19 than all of us here tonight have so far. I happen to know a couple of people, as Corinne does, who have COVID, who had the virus, but who have survived. So I think there is a danger of maybe not ostracizing, but splitting the society into the haves and the have-nots, which I think our current president would love to do, but apart from that. So that's something that worries me a lot. By the way, one of you said that we don't hear about people who are on ventilators. The Detroit Free Press has been doing a series of personal cases of people, mainly Blacks, but not always, who have suffered from the virus, who have been on ventilators. And I just read a really heartrending article last week about a Black couple who both got the virus, who have survived, but the description of their suffering was enough to make me take all the precautions to wear my mask, to maintain social, believe me. So I think we need more of that, and I commend the Detroit Free Press for doing that. It's not easy reading, and a lot of people won't read it, but we have to know what it's like to really get this awful disease and suffer with it and die. A lot of people have died, and the Free Press, to their credit, has published stories about people who have died and the suffering of their families.
Yeah, and thank you for that. A lot of the smaller, local, regional newspapers have done a really good job of that. But because of when we think about this country nationally and what's happening with our testing, with our response to it. None of those has been where it should have been, right? So national news, in a sense, sadly, has its hands really full. But I would love to see more of that. I would love for us to be able to personalize and not make it so abstract.
Right.
That people do die, and this is what it looks like, and this is what it feels like. I know that a lot of research in the AIDS crisis has argued that people like Ryan White came public and was diagnosed a few years before Sontag's essay came out, in fact. That on one level, we can criticize the fact that no one cared until it was like white straight people, and as a gay guy, I totally
And
get
movie stars.
that. You know what I mean? I get that. But it is when people were able to personalize and understand that they knew or loved someone who had this or could have this or who was at risk. That's one of the things that is most troubling to me about our sort of larger representation, is I'd love to see more of that so that we can see it as real people.
Sheila had written about the emerging danger of tropological parts of the metaphors around COVID. I wonder if there's more that she wants to say about that.
I'm sorry, me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about my connection is fading in and out here. Yeah, well, this has been absolutely fascinating, and you know, in connection with what several people have been saying about the sort of response to this. And by the way, those people with Confederate flags are 2 miles from my house at the Lansing State Capitol, so that's been quite extraordinary to witness. But I was struck by something that Sontag says in the first essay, in her analysis of cancer as the rebellion, or as it were, enacting the rebellion of the injured ecosphere, nature taking revenge on a wicked technocratic world. And this resonates with what Phil was saying about the anti-modern element of this and so on. And I have heard several people say just that, and I think that this is also potentially dangerous, especially if one puts that into conversation with the kind of dangers of demonization and othering that people have been talking about. I mean, one of my doctors actually said this to me. She said, "This is what we deserve. This is nature's revenge on us for the damage we've done to nature and climate change, and it's all coming back to revisit us." Now, that may be scientifically true, I don't know, but it seems to me rhetorically very dangerous. And I think I said in comments that I sent to a few of you this afternoon, I saw something in the news earlier this week about a young man who's published a novel for young adults or for children about this. And the narrative of that is sort of, well, what we did before this was terrible, and we polluted the atmosphere and we damaged the climate, but now we're having a kind of conversion and we see the error of our ways and everything is going to be different. And it's not clear really how that is the case. And that this sort of narrative of conversion struck me as frighteningly similar to the narrative that underlies Handmaid's Tale, in which all this climate change and pollution and alleged abuse of women by means of abortion rights all of this is collected into a narrative which is used to justify this authoritarian state. So when I read that sentence of Sondheim's about nature's revenge, I thought, my God, this is Margaret Atwood.
Absolutely. I have too heard people that I was very surprised who would say things that, like, well, what do we expect? Or this is what we deserve, which creates a weird sort of agentic capacity for nature, right? Nature is now the great retributor. Nature is like the Old Testament, it's like sinners in the hands of an angry God. Like, we are like caught again. So that is like troubling, right? Because if that's the case, we're always going to lose. If that really is the sort of way nature is treating us, we're always going to lose. But it's also troubling because it does harken back to some of the things that Sontag talks about and some of the things that we still see. I find at least once a week on social media that gay people are to blame for COVID-19. You know what I mean? Like, it's the homosexuals, it's God's retribution, right? So to me, if this is nature getting even or even balancing itself out, that's just another end of the coin, or another side of the coin, as far as God punishing a community for their sinful ways. God's punishing people for their errors. Now, there is reality, right? When we encroach upon territory, we do come in contact with species. We do these terrible things. But the idea that there's a kind of teleology at play, that there's a kind of retribution, harkens back to a lot of the ways that people understand illnesses as God's punishment.
And given that this illness, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Sheila.
Pardon me?
Go ahead, please. I interrupt you. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just, no, not at all. No, I was just going to say that given how unreadable this disease is, in terms of, we know so little about its etiology, its effects, and so on. I mean, it really is a kind of Rorschach blot that invites all of these sort of metaphoric displacements to include paranoid narratives, racist narratives, anti-Semitic narratives, homophobic narratives. It's really a kind of magnet for all of this kind of discourse, potentially.
Yeah.
Sontag has this.
Wait. I do want to make this one point, because I think there's I really want to pick up on what Kenny said last, which I thought was interesting, and it ties in with what Sheila just said, is that I'm curious about the difference between analysis and metaphorical meaning making, right? So like, I would agree completely that the idea of kind of creating nature as this sort of divine figure that's then, acting as a singular agential teleological being in response to our ecological bad behavior is precisely the kind of thing she's going after, right? Like, that's mythology, that's myth making, right? Mystification. On the other hand, it is interesting to think about the way new knowledge can be produced that is potentially valuable for us, right? So like, for example, our interspecies dependency, right? That we are in fact a species, and the more we interact with other species, there's going to be bonds, connections, displacements that are produced there, right? This reminds us of that, right? And this is actually one of the arguments she makes about AIDS, is that, and I think she's not totally critical of this point. I think she actually believes this to some extent. AIDS taught us that our hubris, in terms of saying that, incurable pandemics were a thing of the past, that modernity had succeeded, right? Like, that AIDS showed us that was not true, right? And so I agree. I want to be super careful, right? In my own mind, in trying to make these distinctions, but I don't want us to give up the idea of analysis, right? Even the kind of analytical work that Phil was mentioning, in terms of like, there is a sort of element of modern contemporary globalized modernity that is at play in the spread of this disease, right? Even as we have to pause and think about and recognize there's so much that we don't know. And if I can, this raises another question that I'd be curious to hear what people have to think about in terms of her treatment of scientific literacy. As Kenny pointed out, she was herself incredibly scientifically literate, it seems to me. But I'm surprised that she doesn't advocate for that as a corrective to metaphor enough, right? Like, she doesn't turn to questions of like scientific education. I don't know, maybe she does elsewhere, but.
No, but I think one of the reasons she doesn't is because science itself relies on metaphor and analogy, right? Whenever someone says, where a physician may say, oh, well, that is the cancer in room 8. That's a metonymic slippage between the person with cancer and the cancer patient in room 8, or that's the cancer in room 8. Like, that's normal, right? It's a busy workplace. There's a lot of reasons why they could do that. But metaphor, analogy, synecdoche, like, science doesn't exist without using those. Physics can't be taught without elaborated sort of analogies, right? There's really good work in the history of science that a lot of the mental models involved and the models involved with chemistry came about through different sort of metaphoric and analogic sort of ways. So in one way, the ventilator is a perfect example in a way, because it's a less brutal way of saying a machine that is breathing for someone, machine that's making those lungs work. So in one way, I don't think a scientific way would get us out of it, but that's also, as someone who'd been through cancer, right, and had come out the other side, I would imagine she also had some probably fair misgivings about the inner workings of medicine itself. Not to be anti-medicine, right, but the struggle of being with cancer and being in a bureaucratic system.
Well, in the essay, she distinctifies between the medical professionals who actually helped and the many who did not. So she sees a significant amount of incompetence, and I think even quackery out there. And so she's worried about that.
Yeah.
Guys, Corinne Stavish has waited for a while. Can I bring her back in?
Please.
Okay, thank you very much. I had a comment, it's been a while, when we were talking about the social distancing, and it occurs to me, I don't know if social distancing is a quote metaphor, but it's inaccurate. We are not socially distancing. We are physically distancing. And somehow our society is more comfortable with the idea that we are socially distancing and is not accurately identifying what is really happening. That was my first comment. My second is we're focusing on the negative metaphors of COVID. What about the heroes? They have made, we are resurrecting mythology, and you said that before, but we're resurrecting positive mythology through these everyday heroes that we have airplane salutes. And then if you're going to cut me off, I had one more comment, and it was what Kenny had said and the whole discussion about deserving and this retribution. We started this series 6 weeks ago with the book of Job. And it seems to me that COVID is taking it full circle. And the doctor who says the people deserve it because of that, it's, Satan, the antagonist, and God, and Job again being punished. Or maybe those people are the three false friends. But it seems to me that COVID and Job have a relationship. And I will now be quiet.
So could I just say something about the hero side of things? This may not be the positive metaphor that we think it is. These people weren't given the chance to do the hero's journey on their own. We pushed them forward and then told them they were heroes, but we haven't given them the hero's portion. We haven't given them the hero's reward, and we have not allowed them to speak for themselves. And so they are not necessarily, they're being called heroes, but it's a very politically expedient thing to do. And I think that our author is worried about that sort of terminology as well. And it goes back to that whole, the general population as opposed to those who are ill, those who are bad enough that they became ill, as opposed to those other Americans who are good and not deviant, who remain healthy. So we've got to be really careful about that hero metaphor.
Okay.
Yeah, I've been trying. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Hello.
Oh, Sheila.
I'm sorry. I was just going to make one tiny point. I've been trying to remember what government official it was, and this was probably back in early March, who said something like, "This disease poses very little risk to ordinary Americans." And I've been wondering. I haven't heard much discussion of that since, but when one looks back upon that, who are the ordinary Americans? Are the 80,000, almost 90,000 people who have died, are they extraordinary Americans? That was a strange rhetorical gesture for a government official to have made at that point.
Very strange. And also weird. Let's be like public health for a moment, right? a lot of ordinary Americans have heart disease and diabetes. A lot of ordinary Americans over the age of like 55 or 65. So it is a very weird move because it does make you wonder who those ordinary Americans are. But it is definitely a move of calm, right? It's like you don't have to worry about it. None of us have to worry about it. Again, a thing that Sontag talks about with the AIDS crisis. It didn't get the general public. It got the others, the foreigners, the sort of deviants. But this was a very weird move because there is no sort of like sort of sexual morality or any of those things involved in COVID-19 in a way.
You know what I promise I'll shut up after this, but I just, given the last few minutes of our conversation, I couldn't sign off without mentioning that I have something on my refrigerator which a friend sent me. I'm not sure of the source of it, but the quotation is, "The whole phrase pre-existing condition is grotesque. It presumes that somewhere there exists a permanently unsick and thus deserving body."
Absolutely.
And I think that is applicable to all of this discourse that we've been hearing, as somebody was just suggesting, so-called previous conditions. Mortality is a previous condition. It's an always already previous condition.
Well, doesn't that go with Sontag's slow apocalypse concept?
Yeah.
So we have all of these terrible apocalyptic things that are happening, but they're happening very, very slowly. So we just live in this constant state of pre-apocalyptic result.
And always looming apocalypse, right?
Always looming. I tell you, the last section of that AIDS.
And I think
Paul? Oh, I think we're. I was just saying the last section of AIDS and its metaphor. So the last time I read this, obviously, was years ago, before the COVID-19. It is amazingly powerful, that last section.
It is.
Because it really helps us see. I understand it now in a way that I wouldn't when I first read it. I was like a teenager in 88. There's no way I was going to read this, right? 88, 89. But there is a sense of almost apocalyptic exhaustion now, climate change, pollution, racism, police brutality, all of these things, the systematic oppression of people of color in this country, institutionalized racism, all those things are true. And I wonder if for some people now, COVID-19 feels like just another kind of looming apocalypse that is going to happen, but not really going to happen again, because for many Americans, they don't know anybody who has died of this. They don't know anybody who struggled with this. So I just found that last section amazingly powerful for 2020.
I feel that intellectual integrity requires that I say something very risky, because we've been talking about the ways in which metaphors that we don't like, metaphors for the COVID-19, can be launched from the political right. On the left, I think, and again, it's risky to say this, but the pandemic is welcome in some respects. We hope it will bring down Trump. In the New York Times, there's a story today. This will give one last final push out the door to coal-powered electric generation, right? Which is also welcome. I remember seeing, again, the New York Times, an article about how for the first time in 75 years, you can see the Himalayas from northern Italy. From northern Iran. Mm-hmm. Not Iran, from India, from northern India, right? You can see the mountains again. So I think that, in fact, in some ways, those of us who are liberal smugly give the left credit for being smarter. And we think, well, now intelligence has to prevail. Now it has to prevail because it's truly an emergency, right? And the metaphor I saw that came from someone on the left was that this pandemic is the great reset. The reset button has been hit, right? And the person who said it, doesn't regret that there's a pandemic.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, because it's one of the, Sontag talks about this, right? Uh, in the height of the AIDS crisis, there were evangelists who were saying something very similar, but from a different perspective, right? There were evangelists that were like, it's great the gay people died, you know, all of that stuff. I mean, Westboro Baptist Church believes that it is a theological proposition that God hates facts. They say that is a theological statement. That is not a political statement. They see that this is God punishing a sinful people. But you would hear people not say, I'm happy that people are dying of HIV and AIDS, but they would see it as this is going to allow a great awakening. We're going to return to God now. People are going to put down the immorality. And I think you're onto something. I think there is a way that we might not be seeing it the same way, and perhaps we may not see it as callous or not be quite as callous, but that idea of something very strongly positive, or this is going to give us something we want as far as universal health care, basic income.
So this is an interesting thing. At the outbreak of World War I, there was a group of radical thinkers who viewed the war as excellent and idealistically wonderful because now we can get rid of everything at one blast. And they actually had a magazine named Blast.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and that was their thesis, that this is great. Now all of these evil people will destroy one another and a new reality can take place. And in a weird way, Sontag writes very negatively about chauvinism, but there is a certain chauvinism of the left in this whole thing. That finally these people are going to get their just desserts. And we righteous ones, we know what those are.
Well, but there's also, I mean, I think this goes back to the process of the fact that metaphorical thinking is going to be evoked whenever the meaning of something isn't fully established or fully able to be like addressed or contained. And so where both the left and the right agree about COVID-19 right now is that it's, you know, put a massive and sudden stop to capitalism as we know it, at least for a small window of time, right? And so this, I think that whether you're bemoaning that as being this judgment, right, on us, or you're celebrating it as this, you know, great reset, in both cases, there's a kind of reality that you are then trying to make meaning out of, right? Make either political meaning or social meaning out of. So I would agree completely that I think Sontag's deeper point is that this kind of attempt to make meaning out of a thing that is in process, that is threatening us, and the extent of which we don't yet know, is kind of inevitable. And also regrettable, right? I mean, that's why she says at the end of the AIDS essay, I was looking, as you were mentioning it, Kenny, I was looking at my text, and she says, with this illness, one that elicits so much guilt and shame, the effort to detach it from these meanings, these metaphors, seems particularly liberating, even consoling. But the metaphors cannot be distanced just by abstaining from them. They have to be exposed, criticized, belabored, and used up. So I think that whatever one's political position is, the sort of ruthless critique of the work of metaphor is kind of necessary on the one hand, yet on the other hand, the recognition that metaphor is one of the things we have to draw from in order to make meaning is also real, right? And I'm thinking an interesting analogy here. We haven't talked a lot about metaphor and the experience of patients, which is, I think, one of the things that her work, to my understanding, has probably been criticized for, because metaphors can be actually incredibly valuable for the experience of the patient. But I'm also reminded of people who say things like, you know, my illness was the greatest thing that ever happened to me, right? Where they have this kind of profound meaning-making personal experience or realization or philosophical insight that comes out of it. Is that a metaphor? Is that dangerous? Is that saying, oh, I'm glad I got ill? I wouldn't go that far, but I do think I think it's one of the ways in which moments of crisis or looming apocalypse solicits or elicits this kind of linguistic work.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think it's only dangerous when we're speaking for another. When I say this thing that happened to me was good for me, it might be a harebrained idea. It might not actually be accurate by observable factors. But when I say that this thing happening to the nation is good for us,
Totally.
and I'm not dying or I'm not sick, that's when it becomes, to me, dangerous. Because it is a kind of othering.
Mhm.
The person who's suffering is just part of collateral damage, to use a military metaphor.
Or to use a religious metaphor, a kind of logic of sacrifice, right? Like, and that I think is the other dangerous side of the language of the hero, that as much as I admire and deeply respect and wish that we were pouring far more resources into our healthcare workers right now, oftentimes the praise is actually a kind of backhanded sacrificial logic, right?
Mhm.
Good
I
on you,
agree.
heroes. You're willing to die for us, right? And frankly, I mean, I fear is that we're going to see that rhetoric being deployed in many sectors in the coming months, right? As the attempt to reopen the economy, as they say, which is itself also a metaphor,
Yes.
is, yeah, I think that we're going to see this kind of tropological language being deployed again and again.
Tropological, what does that mean?
Tropological, I'll tell you later.
There's something that that she says in this that is going back to that whole the general population thing. Every feared epidemic disease generates a preoccupying distinction between the disease's putative carriers, which usually means just the poor and, in this part of the world, people with darker skins, and those defined. Health professionals and other bureaucrats do the defining as the general population. So that's Sontag's take on it. And in a weird way, the hero stuff is also a form of metaphorical defining by, again, authorities who are ancillary to the whole frontline process.
Mhm.
Well, this is just kind of a footnote element of this, but these phantasmal narratives about taking people's temperatures when they enter workplaces or before they get on airplanes, as if this is any indication of anything. In other words, the idea that paradoxically, given how unreadable the disease is, the idea that people can use instruments as crude as merely taking somebody's temperature in their forehead before admitting them to a restaurant or a place of work or a school or whatever to determine whether or not they are ill attributes to the virus a kind of easy readability. That's just a fantasy.
And actually, this opens a whole nother line of discourse, but this gets right into Kenny's work. To what extent are medical practices themselves metaphors, right? In this sense, like taking your temperature is a sign-in for screening you, when in fact, what I'm really just doing is metaphorically screening you, as it were, right? When we know that there's so many asymptomatic cases, right? That doesn't mean that it's not a good public health practice. That's outside of that's not my area of expertise. But it's fascinating how these kind of gestural practices can stand in for like real care.
And it's also, even gestures like that are medically incredibly complicated. What becomes the temperature cutoff? In some states, we're registering it as like anything over, 98.8 or whatever. Others were like, no, like 105, 110. So what becomes the medical cutoff? We actually don't all run the same body temperature. So I happen to I run a very low body temperature. So when I am at like 99, that's actually a pretty high fever for me. So I also use these very crude measures, assuming that the body is one body, that it's just one body that can all be read the same. When someone is actually asymptomatic for an illness. Like these are good measures, right? In a way, we've got to do some of these things, but they're also unbelievably misguided if we think that this is all that it's going to take for us to be able to open things up and everything will be great.
And of course, talking about, speaking of the establishment of invidious distinctions, I've heard talk, as I'm sure you all have as well, of the issuing of so-called health passports that would somehow guarantee that you were, that you had tested negative for the virus so as to enable you to travel. This is all part of this, imaginary of kind of metaphorical imaginary.
Yeah, I've been again, I said I'm obsessed with the signs of the protests and the photos from the protests. A number of people will say things like, to keep the well in their houses quarantined is tyranny. We actually don't know who is well. And so there are ways in which this particular illness really is reshaping some of the ways in which we create those binaries, the sick, the well, the healthy, the unhealthy. It's really sort of upending those in ways that as a kind of body politic, we're not handling very well.
So guys, we've reached 8:30, but this is undeniably a rich discussion, and we still have a small group of people in the audience. Do you want to continue? Sheila, do you want to continue?
I would love to. I would just like to say that I mean this as the highest compliment to everyone participating in this. I come away from this feeling so much worse than I did 2 hours ago. I mean that is the highest possible compliment to the acuity of all of the analysis that I have heard in the last 90 minutes.
Well, that's generous. I want to say something that I've been thinking about listening into these. I've been an audience member in all these symposia, and I've been thinking about the work of intellectual analysis at moments when you have physical crisis. I kind of raised this last week a little bit, and kind of being self-reflexive about what good is it when we're faced with this thing where there's these needs, there's people suffering. People suffering in the news, people are suffering outside the news because of economic hardships. I mean, we're facing unemployment at this point that has not been seen since the Great Depression, right? It seems sometimes a little bit perverse to sit around and talk about metaphor, but I've become more and more convinced it's exactly what we need, because these are such difficult problems that require as much intellectual energy as we possibly can give to them. And so I think that this kind of conversation, while it might not leave us cheered, that might be a sign that it's actually doing something valuable, in the sense that it's sowing the seed for the development of new thoughts and new ideas and maybe new metaphors that could be productive, or at least make us aware of these processes while they're happening. Like I'm thinking, Kenny, what last thing you said, she makes a distinction between contagious and infectious. And she says, one of the hysteria around AIDS was that it was treated as if it was contagious, in the sense that you could just pick it up by being around someone who had it, which mobilized the plague metaphor, which also mobilized the moralization around AIDS, because plague comes from blow or strike, and it was the idea of the judgment, whether the judgment of God, the judgment of nature, right? This kind of moral blow on the body politic. And what strikes me as interesting now is, was it the hysteria of misguided hysteria that didn't actually address the illness, say in the 80s when it came to AIDS, right? The failure to address the illness by the society that makes it harder for us to actually deal reasonably over an actual contagious disease, right? If there's this sort of like historical processes where prior experiences with public health crises and the discourses surrounding them, if we don't analyze how those prior experiences worked or didn't work or failed to work, then we become newly vulnerable to the inability to discuss and carefully and thoughtfully new crises when they emerge. So it's just a kind of offhanded comment, but I found that part of her analysis interesting, because I think that where we are actually dealing with a real contagious disease, we might not have the experience of talking about contagious diseases as effectively as we need to. I don't know if that makes sense.
I couldn't agree more.
Paul, there's an interesting aspect to this, and I think it goes with what Sontag is talking about, and that is that this is the time really where we need to do intensive thinking along the lines of her essay. Right now,
yes,
we haven't actually begun to grapple with the implications of this disease. We've been treating it symptomatically as a society, And we're watching each new development. And to me, the analogy is, as a parent, it's as though your toddler has fallen, and now we're in the silence before the huge scream where we find out how bad things actually are. And we're waiting for that development. And when that societal scream comes, I suspect we're going to have an amazing amount of blame throwing going on. And that health passport that I think Kenny talked about, we have a very strong chance of developing two different cadres of people, right? Those who are okay and those who are victims. And that could be an extremely odd and interesting metaphor. I mean, what does it say if you have a health passport? Who vouched for you? What group do you belong to?
Well, victims or, agents of transmission.
Right. Her whole thing about societies need to have one illness that becomes identified with evil and attaches blame to its victims.
Yeah.
And that's the definition of a master disease, right? I mean, it is interesting to wonder if COVID-19 will persist as a master disease. I mean, there's no question in terms of its like moment of social disruption. We see that happening, you know what I'm saying? But like in the years to come, I think for me, the concept of a master disease is fulfilling those kind of sociological displacements and condensations is useful for seeing how this plays out.
One of the things that's interesting to me, which I'm glad Sontag mentions it in a really great footnote. She mentions one of the very famous AIDS conspiracies. So there were a lot of AIDS conspiracies, a lot of different types, created by the CIA. It was created by the US government in particular. It was given to Africa, and it was given to gay people. The whole idea of patient zero is itself a conspiracy. There's a very good recent book about the problem of the notion of patient zero and how it is very that poor guy was not a patient zero. That whole structure of it. One of the things we're seeing in COVID though is there's blame that is happening, but it's not necessarily being attached to the people suffering. On one side of the political spectrum, it's China. This is all China's fault. They lied about this. They covered it up. There's propaganda. Other side of it, no, it's all Trump. Obama had everything set up, 97-page book on how to do it. Trump got rid of this thing and this thing. That happens a lot. That was happening with HIV and AIDS, right? But there is a way that the people suffering aren't yet being blamed, except when we look at things like those pictures of the protest. So it was hard for me reading Sontag not to think about some of the work that she's written about photography.
Yes.
And so Roland Barthes and others have talked about the way that the photograph is also like photographs of people who are dying. Roland Barthes talks about that early photograph, the guy who was later executed, and how this is a photo of someone who is on the way to die. It's terrible, right? I'm going to confess a lot of sort of morbidness to say this, but when I look at those protests, there's a part of me that's like, oh my God, how many of those freaking people are going to get sick? How many of those people are going to end up in a hospital? How many of those people are going to be struggling all because they don't understand or don't care about, don't realize what it means to be asymptomatic? It will be interesting to see how the kinds of blame gets measured out across different groups of people. But the way that blame is happening largely institutionally by saying it's all Trump or it's all China, I find very, very interesting and different from some of the other diseases that and illnesses that Sontag talks about.
There's a historical precedent with cholera looking at that. Where cholera victims became blamed for introducing the plume of disease into society. And very rapidly, we ended up with things like not just quarantines, but people barricading roads and shooting postal employees who were trying to deliver the mail because they were to blame for cholera before anybody knew that it was a waterborne disease. Sontag talks about cholera a lot in this essay, and she also talks about how to this day, the French use un peur bleu because for any sign of great fear, because cholera victims literally turned blue and wheezened as they dehydrated. And I think some of that cholera reaction might show us where COVID reaction may be going. Now, in Michigan, there is a significant amount of blame from the outstate areas of the city of Detroit. Already predisposed to blame the city for its own ills, but now Detroit has the highest concentration. Well, of course they do. Why do we have to play by their rules? It's an interesting thing to see.
Upstate New York, that's happening in upstate New York as well, where they're the same kind of thing. This is a New York State thing. This is not an us thing. Why are they sort of holding us prisoner? Because they can't handle it.
Well, you'll hate me for saying this, but I mean, I really feel that this discussion tonight needs to be the starting point of analysis of all of this, as a number of people have suggested, and this would make a remarkable basis for a collection of essays. Just pretend I didn't say that.
Well, and there's so many other voices that I would love to hear on this topic, right? So medical practitioners, psychologists who study metaphor, cognitive scientists who study metaphor. I think Phil represents philosophy, so we have a philosopher at the table, but it's a multidisciplinary inquiry.
Oh, it has to be. Is this sort of thing going forward in cultural studies? And I mean, is there a cultural studies interdisciplinary body of discourse going forward around this topic?
Well, Kenny, you work in medical humanities. I mean, this seems to me kind of right up their alley. And
yes. A lot of people in sort of the rhetoric of health and medicine who have been, some of it has been sort of getting people together to help out with very sort of practical communication needs of like healthcare practitioners, right? So getting together, even something as mundane as coming up and sharing blueprints and patterns for how to make face masks, right? The right way and effectively. So it's been really interesting to see a lot of people in my field, both the technical professional communication people, but also the rhetoric of health and medicine people be kind of mobilized. But one of the things that I've seen happen a lot in my own field, and I'm so inspired by Sontag, is the different forms of public engagement that people are trying to do, where they're trying to reach a broader audience, speak to a broader audience. One of the things that I find so moving about Sontag, both of the essays, is they're beautiful, right? These are still aesthetic texts. Like, these are still really beautiful. And challenging in ways. Like, there are sentences that you kind of have to read over again because you'll hit them the wrong way. And it feels very deliberate, like this may not, there are metaphors in this, but she's also doing things sort of syntactically and style-wise to sort of force a reader to slow down. But these are still aesthetic texts. I mean, one of the things that I would love to see more as us as academics, everybody from sociologists to philosophers to historians to physicists, think about what it means to reach a broader public and not give up on aesthetic value for some kind of myth of intellectual rigor or something like that. Like, make it beautiful, man. We need more beautiful. We need more out there that's moving people and not, you know what I mean? Like, not just, we can be intellectually engaged and sort of aesthetically moved. And I would love to see more of us out there doing stuff like that.
So I would agree completely. I would actually, to make everyone feel worse again, I think that we actually are living a kind of renaissance of that kind of work. When you look at the rise of like internet publications and kind of the call for, public public forms of address, something about like LA Review of Books or Public Books or N+1 or there's so many great public facing academic writing going on out there. The downside is I think it's academics who are primarily the ones reading that work and finding it beautiful. And that's one of the things I admire about Sontag's piece is that, there is clearly a kind of New York intelligentsia set tone that comes out, but I still find it very accessible, and you don't get the impression that she's speaking down to her readers, and you also get the sense that she wants to connect with anyone. Like, you really feel like, to me at least, she wants sick people to read this essay and find an idea, right, that they might be able to use and kind of take with them. So in one sense, it's like, it's her way, her idea is her mask, right? It's her recipe for a face mask that she's putting out there into the world. And I think it still resonates.
That idea of offering an idea instead of a narrative, instead of a personal story, but offering something other people can think about and build off of and agree or disagree with critically is really important. One of the things that I've seen from a lot of the literature coming out right now is that people are coming out with an opinion that they want to impose on other people around them. Very few seem to be offering an idea for people to wrestle with, think about, and give legitimate feedback to.
Well, guys, since this is the end of the symposium, do you mind if I make just a few brief remarks to wrap this up? When I started this 6 weeks ago, my fear was that 6 weeks was going to be too long, that we would all be back to our normal life and the symposium would be continuing of questionable relevance. And it has not turned out that way at all. Now it seems like as if we're on the threshold of bigger and worse things. I worry that in a few years we'll look back and we'll say, why were we reading Pepys? Why were we reading Thucydides? We should have been reading John Steinbeck and Studs Terkel, right? Since it seems that we're on the verge of dire economic times. So Sontag's discussion of how language is metaphorical, all language is metaphorical, reminds me of Richard Rorty, the great American philosopher pragmatist, who discussed truth as social justification. What is true is whatever resonates, whatever finds traction, currency within the linguistic community, right? And Rorty was also known for the idea of the conversation of philosophy. Now, Sarah Fuchs, one of the panelists several weeks ago, brought up Boethius, whose book is The Consolation of Philosophy. So we have the conversation of philosophy and the consolation of philosophy. And I think, in fact, conversation is a consolation, and consolation is a conversation. And this is the real business of the humanities. What we do is we enter into a sustained conversation with each other and with the great text of the past. And the discussions that follow are never resolved. The issues are never resolved. The point is not to resolve them. The point is to come together and to continue to generate something that's culturally valuable, right? Boethius takes me back to Job. Job, of course, is involved in two very interesting conversations, a conversation with God and a conversation with the false comforters. Boethius is involved in a conversation with someone who is not a false comforter. It's philosophy, and she's brutal. She's brutal and she's direct. And she tries to explain his suffering within the context of free will. She says, we are the captives of our own liberty. So philosophy is being paradoxical. We're the captives of our own liberty. But after all, the reason we're experiencing a global pandemic is as a consequence of our own liberty. We've created a modern world. We've created a world, because we've been so successful in eradicating disease, the human population has soared, creating conditions for new diseases, right? And this is not something for us to resolve. This is something for us to talk about. Something for us to talk about. In Sontag's essay on AIDS, there's this wonderful quote from John Donne: as sickness is the greatest misery, so the greatest misery of sickness is solitude. And solitude is what we're fighting by coming together to talk. And solitude is what the humanities always offer us an escape from. We can escape our solitude with the great text of the past, right? And that's what this has meant to me. That's the level at which I have most enjoyed this symposium. I thank you, and I thank all the people who were involved in it. I hope it was meaningful and enjoyable to you too.
Thank you, Phil. And thank all of
Thank you, Phil.
for joining us this evening. It was really a wonderful conversation.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks. It's great to
This has
meet
been
with you.
marvelous. Thank you all.
Have a good night. Be safe.